on YouTube, sorry. It's preparing to live stream.
Got it. It's now streaming.
Are we there?
I can see it.
Great. I am just going to. Sorry, I just have to. I know what I have to do. Okay, I think we're ready to go.
Okay, great.
Excellent. So welcome everyone. My name is Michael Longford, and I'm an associate professor with the digital media program here at York University. And I just want to welcome you to our inaugural AI Talks. AI Talks is a new speakers series that we're launching this year, examining how artists are working with artificial intelligence and machine learning to question and subvert current AI systems that increasingly shape our understanding of ourselves and our engagement with the world around us. We're very happy today to welcome Špela Petrič, who is, as I said, our inaugural talk. And what I'm going to do now, just before I do that, I just want to thank the Digital Media Program, which is a joint program with the Lausanne School of Engineering and the School of the Arts, Media, Performance and Design here at York University. I also want to welcome Roberta Biorani's class, which is the Quantifying the World course at the University of Toronto. And with that, I'm now going to turn it over to Jane Tingley to do our land acknowledgement.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. So before I get into my land, the territorial acknowledgement, I recently heard a colleague of mine actually give a land acknowledgement where the speaker revealed a little bit about himself and his history. And it got me thinking about my own story, my family's history here in Canada, or should I say Turtle Island. So I want to share with you just a quick story so that you understand what the land acknowledgement means to me, and then I'll go into the land acknowledgement and then pass it over to Roberta. So I wanted to share with you the story about, so my grandmother 15 years ago, she passed away, and she left behind many letters, letters that came from her great-great-grandparents. So I guess my great-great-great-grandparents. And these letters told a story of two people of different religious backgrounds, Protestant and Catholic, who fell in love and had to flee across Canada in order to share their life together. I'm not sure how they crossed Canada, but my great-great-great-grandmother wrote of camping and sleeping beneath a canoe during a rainstorm. And I can only imagine that they traveled by foot and they portaged across Canada and benefited from the knowledge of the land and the pathways defined by the Indigenous peoples who walked the land way before the settlers arrived. So for this, I can only be grateful, as safe passage across Turtle Island led my family to settle in Manitoba, to put down roots and make a family and to thrive. So while I'm grateful that my family was given the opportunity to grow and thrive, I also understand that many Indigenous families did not. And it is for this reason that I'm committed to truth and reconciliation as the only way forward to establish a future where Indigenous peoples can thrive and self-define in Canada. I find the territorial acknowledgement to be important as it reminds us that this land has a very long history, which is important to both speak about and to remember. So I'd like to start by recognizing that Manitoba is on Treaty 1 territory. It is a traditional territory of the Anishinaabeg, the Cree, the Oji-Cree, the Dakota, and the Dene people, and also is the homeland to the Métis Nation. I've now moved to Takaranto with my husband, which has been taken care of by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and the Métis. It is now home to many diverse First Nations, and I, as well as York University, would like to acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. In addition, we in the Department of Computational Arts in AMPD would also like to acknowledge the virtual networks on which our activities and gatherings are cited, is a product of Silicon Valley and the Zoom headquarters that are located on the Muwekma Ohlone territory. So thank you very much. And I pass it on to Roberta.
Okay. So know what is happening. I don't see myself, but that's okay. So because I pinned you. So I'm actually very honored to introduce Špela. I met Špela a few years ago during very fabulous event in Corfu, in the Greek islands. And at that time, I had the honor of seeing one of her installations, which was like a durational performance called Scolopoiesis, which means shaped by darkness. And I became very fascinated with her work. And I think that her work somehow expresses one of the most interesting, if not the most interesting part of her work, which is profoundly which is the relationality. So her work, whether it focuses on the strange encounters between humans and plants, or between machines and plants via humans, it always has this very reciprocal and non-hierarchical type of communication between different species. And so by doing so, these plants become also the vehicles to commentaries on surveillance capitalism, or plant and human relations, alien encounters between non-human intelligence, and so this is what I really find very interesting of her work. So now the formal stuff. Špela Petrič is Ljubljana and Amsterdam based new media artist who's been trained in both the natural sciences and in the arts, and the natural sciences. So she holds a PhD in biology, and as artistic practice combines the natural sciences, wet biomedia practices, and performance. And she's currently working as a researcher at the, correct me if I'm wrong, the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, studying how automation of care manifests in various spheres, from horticulture to human-machine interaction. And she received also several awards, such as the White Aphroid, the Outstanding Artistic Achievement, the Bioart and Design Awards in the Netherlands, and an award distinction at Prix Ars Electronica in Austria. So without further ado, Špela.
Thanks so much, Roberta, Jane, and Michael. I'm really honored to be invited and a bit humbled. I've only recently, let's say, started involving artificial intelligence and computation in my work. And I do this through the collaboration with engineers and programmers and computer scientists and so forth. So it's definitely like a collective effort and also a huge process of learning for me, which I also find exciting, right? But nevertheless, like, I'm no expert in this, so I would just like to share the process with you. Like a little bit about how I got to be here. So as a PhD in biochemistry and molecular biology specifically, I was really interested in the wider context of scientific knowledge being produced. So it seems kind of obvious for me that I couldn't stay only within the sciences. And then once I realized that this very florid field of bioart had been developing, I found myself amidst really great and interesting topics and even greater people. And so I've been actually working here in this field with living organisms for about a decade. And now I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Can you see can you see it and hear me? Is everything okay?
Perfect. We can hear you and see everything. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks. Okay, so I'm kind of working or have been working with plants extensively, but actually this didn't start from a fascination I had with plants, but rather it's opposite. So I was actually plant blind, and much like you have probably noticed the rabbits first and foremost, so did I. So I was kind of oblivious to all this grass and dandelions and daisies that were forever in the background, even though as a trained biologist, I understood how constitutional they were for our environment, for basically all of life on Earth. And this kind of provoked me. I was annoyed by my ignorance. And through the artworks that I would undertake, I tried to, first of all, understand better where this plant blindness comes from, and then also try to find ways of overcoming it, sort of as also a model of how to approach this otherness in whichever shape or form it exists. So it was happening during this conception of these works, or at least the kickoff of the series, happened during the first migrant crisis, right, where we had to find a relation to these other people, and I thought only the worst was coming out of from societies that first before this kind of felt familiar and comfortable, but from that point on weren't really, because they had absolutely no way of making a relation to the other work in a kind and open manner. Okay, so this is where my desire for plants comes from. So I was annoyed by them first and foremost. And so if you look at plants, actually, there's several properties that they have biologically that make it nigh impossible for us to relate to them through some sort of authentic anthropomorphization or this kind of authentic empathy. So while we, like historically, the Western philosophical tradition kind of supports the good life or the qualities of a good life based on human properties, which is like we have autonomy, we have an interiority with an identity and essence. So this is based on, this is sort of the yardstick based on which we judge other organisms and define them as simple or as primitive or basically living resource. And in fact, plants, the way that they live is just not, I mean, these properties are not necessarily needed for their survival. Because we can't really talk about identity in the same way when you fabulously clone yourself, right? Or autonomy, we find a hard time of understanding this expression of autonomy when plants seem to be stuck in place, right? Although in this case, it's also because we aren't really looking at what plant autonomy is on their terms. And similar with essence and identity. So historically, they've basically been rendered these passive organisms which we secretly fear. Even the advent of these anthropophagic plants, so plants that have some properties of animals, only began to really occur when Darwin connected all living organisms in this tree of life. So before there was just sort of a clear cut between plants and animals, and then from that point on, we needed to create monsters to patrol that border and to reassure us that we are nothing like a plant. Okay, so this is not just some biological predisposition that we have towards plants. It's culturally constructed and also maintained through language, for example, right? That's why you have like a real fear of becoming stuck in a coma where you are just a vegetable. So we even use the language that refers to plants to describe this kind of state of passivity. Or in Slovene, we have a slur. So we call somebody a ficus when they are basically, we think that they're incapable of acting. Okay, so that's sort of the setting of what kind of made me think about how this relationship could be conceived otherwise. And one of the starting points was actually to alienate it from the ordinary, from the mundane, not in terms of the materiality of the relationship, but in terms of the context and the story that is told around them, around the performative ways of having plants and people come together in different scales, right? Like physical scales. So as Roberta mentioned, one of the first work in this series called Confronting Vegetal Otherness was Scotopoiesis. And it was just, using really basic biosemiotics to say, okay, let's have a conversation with the plant, or not necessarily conversation, but I would like to enter the plant's perceptual milieu, whatever it takes, and the plant would sort of acknowledge my presence by somehow giving us a sign, a recognizable sign. So I stood in front of the crest, illuminated from behind, for about 20 hours, taking breaks. So it wasn't really about human endurance, nor about, this capacity of the artist to do something unthinkable, but really about surrendering to the plant, committing myself to this, to see what actually happens and how these effects, what kind of consequences this action has. So this was from a performance at Click Festival in Helsingor. This is the close-up of a cress. So the cress, I chose the cress because it's actually from this area of the Middle East and Egypt. And it has a really rapid life cycle. So in 2 weeks, basically, it goes from seeds to full plant blooming, and then a seed, becoming a seed again. So that it actually completes all this in these 2 weeks of rainy season. And so for this process, when I committed for 20 hours, but that's really short time in terms of the plant. So I basically chose the plant that was most accommodating my kinetic nature. But still, okay, this is from a performance in Bourges. The people came, and this was the result. So you could clearly see that there was an impression of my shadow, and you could say, aha, the plants were in fact somehow materially and physically responding to my presence there. And this is a process called etiolation, as it was mentioned before. So it's basically a response to the absence of light, where plants basically invest their energy more into growing out of the shadow rather than photosynthesizing. And it has to do with their perception, right? So it's like plants have photoreceptors all over their body, and they respond, they sort of regulate a lot of things, from circadian rhythms to growing and blooming and all that. So you can imagine plants having eyes all over their bodies. But in this case, I think it was, the work was really about this very basic question of the relationality between a human individual and plants, which there were many. But just in order to get over this really basic presumption, that we have this perfect diametral hierarchy of the person or human versus the plant, let's enact it. And this came out. And of course, again, like all of my artworks, there's something that happens on the surface that is visible, but then there's also things that are not obvious that are happening simultaneously, and those I think are just as important. So in this work in particular, we have to recognize two things. these 20 hours and this kind of construction was there not to allow the plant to sense me, because plants are so sensitive that in fact just, you know, by moving your hand over them quickly and creating a brief shadow, they will already respond to it. Not to mention like all the volatile compounds that you're giving off, they sense you and you eat the cress. So your body is not only, you know, when you have it on a sandwich or in a soup, that is like a time of not just nutrition and calorie exchange, but also information exchange. So in this way, this is really, you know, me playing the human, needing to be recognized in this way that is apparent to me and to the audience. And sort of also because of this gap opening and because of me explaining it to you in this case, it's again, you know, pointing to our general ignorance. But as we cannot escape it fully, you know, at least I think it's our job to sort of point to it. The other thing that happened, which was a little bit more unexpected, was that while I thought, okay, my shadow would become the index, signaling from the perspective of the crest, signaling to me standing there, the shadow and this whole construction, not just the shadow, but also myself, I became the index to the audience, which now finally focused their attention on the crest. So there were different levels of semiotics going on, and I think some were more poetic and more important than I had originally envisioned as the experiment. On the other hand, this whole performance or experience had also changed me deeply. I sort of spent then, you know, ever since then, I'm in pursuit of finding ways to communicate things and insights which are not able to be communicated with language. And that is, I think, another level of motivation for my subsequent works, right? How to talk about something without using words. So another one of these projects is phytoteratology, so making plant-human monsters. In this case, I wanted to, okay, not just literally take, you know, Haraway's words literally, like make babies, make kin, not babies, but also can we make kin by making babies? Somehow I wanted to play with this potential of molecular biology and this plant tissue culture to push the boundaries between human and plant, but also to push the boundaries between kinship, right? So how far can you take this mothering, metaphorically mothering, being a plant mama, right? And then to actually conceiving plant babies. For me, it was never really about putting my DNA into the plant, because I think it's a topic that needs to be critiqued, and it has been so after in this advent of genomics and like whole genome sequencing, we had been really focusing on the DNA as a sort of lost soul, right? The soul that gets transferred from generation to generation while the body dies. Well, I'm kind of very much inclined to say that the environment or the cell and this apparatus is just as important, right? So here, thinking about making plants human monsters was just as well creating an artificial womb in which these plant babies would swim, that would be overflowing with my hormones, right? Which are information molecules, basically, like we had before. This biosemiotics that happened through the shadow, it happens even more so through these molecules. So these are photos of how I isolated steroid hormones from my urine, and I activated them. and then proceeded with this procedure called somatic embryogenesis, where you go and start with sort of stem cells, plant stem cells, and then from a single stem cell, you can create the whole plant outside the seed. So usually this process is hidden and it's in the seed. And here it's actually, revealed. The irony of this was that I felt like it would, kind of bring a different type of viscerality in the relation between me and this Arabidopsis plant, which I was working with. But it made me realize something quite different, which is by using these procedures of molecular biology and following practices of sterility in order to, manipulate these babies. There was like this wedge between us, right? I could never really feel them. They always had to be behind this glass. And I was constantly sort of battling fungi and bacteria to try to keep them alive. But Arabidopsis is a naturally occurring weed, right? It grows in sort of these degraded areas with gravel, not a lot of nutrients. And normally you would see it and you would pull it out, in a garden. It's got really tiny flowers. So somehow in this setting, it's like super precarious, right? So there's like a lot of what would be property of myself as a full person and of this plant as, Arabidopsis, the tail cress. It was all very much taken away, and instead the relationship was unfolding following the rules of these biomedical protocols. That was something quite, that made me think a lot about, first of all, science as such, which I have been addressing actually since I left it. But then also thinking about how much using the methodology of science actually leads to certain presumptions and sort of shorthands that, this use of biotech immediately stands in for something sophisticated, for some mastery, and for a promise of a future that carries within it this legacy of the past. So all the violences, as well as, discoveries. I won't be super negative about it, but it's super, super hard to disentangle the two. So it's sort of a bullet that you have to bite, right? I mean, I think it's an important task to keep gnawing at, the full, this full spectrum of consequences that science and technology has in our society, but also with this awareness that it's hard to read it. It's hard to construct a narrative other than the one it's telling it, on its own, right? So with this, with all this insight, I started a next step in this artistic journey that welcomes not just like biological technoscience, but also computer science into the mix, to make it even harder to control and to disentangle my hopes and desires with actually what the technology wants. So the plant machine project is sort of, it's a pitch, right? But then, so don't take it literally. It's about creating a machine that thinks itself a plant. And I think the choice here to compare or to bring the plants and the machine, in this case, algorithms and AI, into proximity is kind of, on one hand, redundant, because if any organism has been in close proximity with machines, it's been plants, right? In agriculture specifically. On the other hand, I think this kind of intensification of this relationship is also quite pertinent, specifically because there is something ambiguous, or like we are, because of these properties of plants, which we might want to refuse, but we still understand them, at least in some way, this way, because of our cultural context. I think they're like really generous creatures to think about certain things that would be unacceptable for us to think if we were putting a human in the place of a plant. So I hope I'll try to sort of explain this a little bit further. So throughout these investigations, I have okay, first of all, plants have started to resonate with me. But there's something else that happened. When I started reading into all these principles on which algorithms work, and AI is basically built as we know it now. Some of the basic tenets of how to create and organize data sets, put them into categories, how there's an absolute need for using proxies that are sort of a quantifiable measurements that stand in for something else, which was also based on a realization based on statistics, etc. There's a sort of a way of describing the world per partes and sort of a rational logical with a rational logical principle that misses and flattens so much of this intricacy, so much of this, what it means to have him be a body and interact with other bodies. So I found that actually what we are complaining about in relation to algorithms and how we are processed through internet, I mean through Facebook and smartwatches and phones and all this, this is basically how we have been treating plants all along, right? So in this way, it's kind of interesting to think of plants not as something on the other side of this ontological ladder, but in the eyes of the algorithm, we are equally flattened. And so this statement that sort of guides this opus is, in the eyes of the algorithm, we are all already plants. And this is called the Vegetariat. So the Vegetariat, by sort of this definition, the term was coined by Kate Sandilands. And I'm not sure if she uses it precisely the same way I do, but I'm just really in love with it and this potential that it holds for me as a sort of on this process of proletariat, precariat, vegetariat, right? What is it when there comes this ultimate flattening between the body and a commodity and the laborer, right? Where these things can no longer be disentangled, specifically in the gaze of the algorithm. That for me is kind of like a working hypothesis to explore these relations further. So this is a lot of talk, but of course, when it comes down to actually making works that would somehow encompass this, it becomes really, really difficult and really tricky. So I approach the really serious topics usually with a little bit of humor or a lot, just to sort of be able to introduce something that is like super complex in a way that I think is still inviting and hangs on to some sort of hope and also some distance, right, between us and like this future that seems so dark and gloomy. So I'll talk about 3 works, and I think the last one is sort of maybe also most relevant to your class because it builds an AI. But the first one is this Institute for Inconspicuous Languages, Reading Lips. Maybe you might have heard of this twittering spinach or emailing spinach or tweeting tree. there are all sort of scientific ways of promoting these advanced sensing modalities that have been developed for real-time observation of plants, put to like different uses, right? So this emailing spinach is detecting, it's actually injected with nanoparticles that sense the presence of some explosives in the soil or something like that. And so based on that, it sends a signal, yeah, this is where I sense some pollution or some of these substances. And the other one, like the twittering tree, is basically a tree that reports on its state in Wageningen. Of course, these are all sort of scientifically, I mean, the scientists basically write the emails, right, for the tree, and the tree is just basically responding or sending, there's sensors, it's not even the tree sending these this information, it's the sensors on the tree. But in response to this, this is another proposal. So lip reading actually goes a little bit like this. Here we go.
Isto mama. Ma che mogoče ga. Spodaj se vidi ga, mama ga.
Okay, so what you saw there was actually these stomata. So they're leaf pores, and the Tradescampsia zebrina, or the inch plant, has thousands of them on every leaf, kind of like all plants do. They're pores through which the plants breathe, because all the rest of their bodies are protected with this waxy layer called the cuticle. And if you look at them through the microscope, and if you do a time lapse and speed it up, they will start basically opening and closing like mouths. And this apophenia happens like for both the human interpreter, Bojan Mort, who's actually lip reading based on what he had learned from interpreting humans, as well as this LipNet algorithm, which is a neural network trained on human lips. And they're both kind of struggling to do the same. But similar to the situation with scotopoesis, right? Here we are focusing on these words that come from mouths, supposedly, while we are sort of ignoring that this communication between bodies is already going on a chemical level, if nothing else, right? So it's kind of humorous, not just because we recognize lips where there aren't any lips as like that would speak in this way, but also that we are, sort of incessantly focusing on this technology that would help us communicate with plants, right? But not really allowing the sense of or the definition of communication to be broadened, right? And sort of in a similar vein, Vegetariat work 0 also sort of takes a humorous, speculative approach to total body surveillance. And specifically, so I'll just let this run. Yeah, so here what we have is basically an extension of this hack that people are actually using. So in certain countries, or I would say in all corporate environments, at one point or another, it seemed like a good idea to give out these pedometers to employees. So they would engage in some healthy competition, see, you know, who exercises more, who's fitter, or sometimes, as you might have overheard in the clip, some companies are actually deducting insurance, deducting the amount of insurance they pay, the more they're active. And of course, the natural response to this is for people to start hacking these devices, right? So one of these hacks, because they're really, the software is super closed and super protected. So it makes much more sense to do like a quick and dirty hack, as in, yeah, you put it on a drill machine or a bicycle or your pet and you just rack up steps, right? But here I really, I thought about how actually these algorithms and like what happens to the data downstream, they don't really have a direct, they don't have direct access to the organisms, to the people that made the data. So the algorithms are kind of indifferent to the source that produces the data. It might as well be plants. And if, you know, all this data is somehow harvested and products are made, I followed this logic and thought about how perhaps we need to make plants into consumers or bioworkers consumers as we are, if we want this big other to pay attention to them in a similar manner, right? To be concerned with what the plant's drives and desires are, like we feel we are kind of victims of, right? Like being manipulated and triggered. And so this work is about creating this sleight of hand where actually plants are now the users of smartwatches. And the way this is done is it actually listens in on electrochemical signals. So it's something like akin to nerve signals that we would have traveling on nerves. Well, plants are also electrified, right, in this manner, only they don't have nerves, so the signals travel through phloem, which is like veins. But the point is that we amplify these signals, so there's just some noise. It's actual innate activity of these plants that then gets recorded by the smartwatches, and each smartwatch has its own application, and this data is just sent somewhere, right? And we don't know what happens to it. So, and this project opens up, you know, the whole sphere of what is going on with this bio data that we produce, and who else can produce it. Like, how do we make plants in this vegetariat that we are? And so finally, and I don't want to take much longer, but we can discuss this project later as well, I mean, in conversation, is play. And play is PL, you know, plants apostrophe AI. And it's precisely about what the title says. It's about making an AI controlled robot that would be able to enter plants' time in order to play with it. And I'm not talking about a game, I'm talking about this ontological play, which is open to the construction of the organisms that are partaking in it. You know, play as a necessity of all living beings, which is non-utilitarian and is driven sort of by joy and by just this having a body, or being a body, and being a body with other bodies in gravity and physics and in social structure. And so starting from the vantage point that plants as actors that have like a long evolutionary history must have all the properties that makes them live, and play is one of them. So we kind of came together as like a big team of collaborators from different backgrounds and disciplines. and started thinking about where plants would play. So the proposal was that play is about an expression of freedom, and these tendrils that you see here at the end of cucumbers, or on opposite each leaf of the cucumber, have sort of a mission, right? They need to find something to hold on to. But because there's many, and because they also have sort of a limited time, they seem to also express some non-intentionality, or sort of something that exceeds our understanding of what a purely functional thing would be. So my imagination is that they have freedom in these tendrils, at least for a little while, which we also observed, because sometimes they would wrap around something and they just decide, not, I don't want this anymore. And so these tendrils move relatively fast, so they would complete this full circle in about half an hour. And there's also quite a lot of them, so this game or this play could go on for a little while. So the idea was, how do you make, what is the architecture of this robot that will be designed solely with the purpose of playing with this cucumber plant in mind? And what we came up with was, of course, something that you can divide into categories of sensor, right? So we had to have like a way of the robot sensing the cucumber plant, which is what Tim is holding here on the picture. So this is a trolley with a LiDAR scanner that gets sort of a rough image of the cucumber plants. This is actually from the first experiment when we were trying to scan plants. And in fact, this machine it can be purchased in agriculture, and it costs like 47,000 euros. So we said, okay, can we hack it? And yeah, I think we did with this, with this LiDAR cheap autonomous vehicle sort of kit that costs 800 euros. And then a lot of, ingenuity in terms of how to actually make it do like this 280 loop around the plants. And so this is from the first time we were able to get it to actually turn a corner. So this is kind of funny. It's like a small detail that took us almost like half a year. And this is sort of the result. So you see, the resolution isn't really that great. And then, so this is sort of the first proposal of what it would look like. So the robot actually moves slowly. So it has tendrils that are made of wires, steel wires, and these bouncy balls at the end to remind us that it is our desire that builds the robot. And then it can move these robots really slowly, so at the pace of the plant. And this is us trying to build this in order to get it to work. The premiere was in December of last year, so this is actually during pandemic, when it was really hard to obtain parts, but we kind of managed to pull it off in the last moment. For those who are interested in what actually the AI does, and I think this is, oops, sorry, I'm seeing this annoying chat here. Can we close it? Sorry. No. Okay, I'll just talk regardless. So for those who are interested, like, one of the biggest questions was, how do you write an algorithm that would play with plants without presuming, or with presuming as little as possible about what this interaction should be? So at first we thought, okay, let's do some reinforcement learning where the plant is this expert or is like a classifier and it teaches the algorithm. But for that, you also need a lot of data points, and plants are slow to begin with. And so it seemed to get, we kept bumping up against impossibilities. And the more, the initial idea was even to model the plant, right? And then we do the prediction of how it would actually move. And this is something that scientists are attempting, but it's a multi-million-dollar project to make like the first digital twin of a tomato, for example, right? And for me, this sort of defeated the purpose, because it's not about understanding the plant as passive. I'm not even seeing a plant as something to be modeled. It's about what happens there in this unique encounter with these particular plants and this particular neural network and this particular robot. So our conclusion was to make like a simple autoencoder that would basically take all these images that it gets, these 3D scans, in this latent space. So it's kind of what its experience of the plants in the past has been. And then it would approach the plants not only from what it sees, but rather it would filter the image, or it would run the actual image that it takes. So in the last one, through this latent space, and then move according to the image of the plant, which has now been influenced by its prior knowledge of the plant, or prior experience of the plant. And then we would add this final element, which is the plant as the classifier. So in fact, we have a whole different system when the plant actually grabs on. And this directly influences the latent space. So on one hand, it changes the neural network structure, the weights in the neural network. On the other hand, this is also a signal for the robot to stop moving that tendril. So gradually, as this interaction happens, the robot loses degrees of freedom. And in a way, so does the plant, right? Because it's now sort of its body follows the possibility that was given by the robot. So if the robot glitches somewhere, right, the plant would perhaps like to hang on to a ball, but it can't find anything there. So this is, there are two images of what the installation looks like. And this is a time lapse of play between this robot and the plants happening. And it's actually from time while we were still doing the prototyping, but it's good for an impression. And so this work has now had quite a long time of being I mean, during the pandemic, when nobody was able to access, it was actually on display, not on display for 3 months, right? And so I think as it's growing older, so are we becoming more experienced, and now we're trying to adapt or modify the algorithm so that it has more complex functions, so that there would be another layer where the algorithm would be curiosity driven. So it's not just, it wouldn't just be, approaching the proximity of the plant, but really also being able to decide which areas would be interesting to approach. And this is from this installation, iFicus it was called, that showed all these works. Okay, so I'll stop here. Thank you so much. I hope I wasn't too long.
That was perfect. It was amazing. Thank you. Clap, 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 clap. Thank you so much, Špela. That was really fascinating. I've got so many thoughts whirling around in my brain right now. So I just wanted to ask everyone wait, I've got you pinned. Let me see if I can figure out how to change. So I'm not certain if everyone in the chat feels free, you can turn on your videos so that we can all see a bunch of faces. That would be super ideal. We've got people who are on YouTube, so you can ask questions there, and we've got people in the Zoom room. You can either unmute yourself and ask questions, or you can ask questions in the chat. And if Roberta wants to translate the questions that maybe her students are asking. Great, excellent. And yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for that really fascinating talk. I myself am working with plants and trees, and I have a lot of thoughts and things that you brought up that are just exactly on my mind right now. But I did want to mention that I grew my first cucumber this summer, and it was the most amazing plant ever. It just sort of took over my yard and gave me so many cucumbers. And one, I always had this sort of rocky soundtrack in my head as it grabbed different poles and worked its way up to the top, like it was just formidable. And I guess one of the questions that I had for you was, in your experience, because I think it's really interesting how you talk about algorithms. To the algorithm, we are plants, and you know, we see ourselves as complex, and of course plants are really complex. And I'm just wondering, in all the stuff that you've been playing with and toying with, what has working with plants and thinking about algorithms and training algorithms, what have the plant taught you about training algorithms for sort of understanding the complexity of the world? Or could you talk a little bit about sort of your thoughts on, I don't know, what you've learned in this whole experience of sort of trying to balance, you know, these two different temporal realities and two different types of living life?
Yeah, well, I think I'll start with this, the reason why I think, again, no, plants are really great partners in this relation. For me personally, because I'm totally partial to them, right? So I want to reduce them. I will do everything that is in my power not to perform some, like this obvious violence, right? But then at the same time, there's very little that I can say about them that is not relational, that I haven't somehow come to, you know, in terms of they are sort of on this horizon of what is knowable and sort of colonizable in terms of their ontologies. And that is, for me, sort of a really great point of departure, so that it maintains the tension and the discomfort, because like all the decisions that you need to make while writing coding for them, or coding a program that would do something to the plant, right? You need to choose your proxies, right? And I think that it's sort of easier if you're coding for a human. There would be assumptions that you can make based on your purchase of what it is to be a human. Or so we like to make this generalization, right? And this isn't really possible with a plant. So I think it kind of pushes this discomfort, right? Like, okay, and when I first started the conversation with the programmers, of course I was naive, and they were also naive as to, you know, what I'm actually after. So they came up with this really logical way of like making sort of a decision tree, right? And on top of the decision tree is the question: is the plant okay? Yes/no, right? And so this is kind of the point where it's become sort of the main phrase, or the catchphrase of internal catchphrase of our project, right? Because this is something that just can't really be determined objectively. We can't choose proxies. You know, is it green? Does it seem like it's flourishing? And by flourishing, we can describe the number of cucumbers it produces, the color of the leaves, or whatever. Or if we grow them at home, you understand when a plant is flourishing, and you would probably say it's happy, right? And this is based on, I don't know how many leaves it's dropped, the color, you know, like sort of it's this, is the plant okay? Yes, no, exists in a space that intuitively I think is much easier to determine than objectively, unless you're willing to accept these kind of really brutally reductionist proxies. And so the decision is not to pose this question, you know, but to live in this space of what if we can't, or what if we choose not to determine it as a yes and no option. And I mean, for me, this is sort of the algorithms that I would like to have in my like living environment, ones that don't necessarily presume what I am, you know, and what I do and what I'm motivated by, right? And so that's why I think like they're a really wonderful character to write for, because they're so, from my perspective, you know, kind of uncolonizable, and yet you can totally love them, right? So it's not like an objective relationship where you cut the subject and object and the object is there and you can poke it and prod it and do whatever because you have distanced yourself from it. The affection is still there, but sort of the presumption of what is good for it can't really be reduced. So it leaves it, sort of leaves it open. I'm not sure if I answered the question, but it's sort of almost like setting ourselves up for failure, because we're asking the algorithms to do something that they basically cannot, right? Because they're just premised on basically logic, you know? And this is sort of looking for this mistake or like an emergence of something else.
Right.
Yeah.
No, that's a really great answer. Thank you. Yeah. I want to make sure I give space to everyone. Roberta, do you have anybody in your class who has a question that you'd like to field? Because I have one in the chat here, but we'll put it over to you, Roberta.
Yes, we have a question from. You wanna ask the question?
Sure. Wait, can you hear me by any chance?
Can you hear him?
Yeah.
Here.
Right.
Sorry.
I'll try to be as loud.
Oh, you muted yourself accidentally.
Sorry. There you go.
Okay, I'll try to be as loud as possible. And after looking at the scope of Luis's project, it really makes me think, like, how do we determine like a criterion in like establishing whether like communication between humans and plants have been established? Because like it could be argued that like it's just like the shadows and like the plants responding to that rather than the humans themselves in this example.
Yeah.
You hear it okay?
I mean, yeah. I mean, there's like several ways of answering this question, okay? The first one is that in fact it wasn't just the shadow, right, that was registering me. So it was all the things that were also happening because of my presence there. So I was speaking, so there was vibrations, I was sweating, and you know, like giving off all these chemicals. And we know that plants have sensors, and we're learning about, you know, increasingly more of their sensorial apparatus. So they're actually absolutely sensitive to the environment, right? The question is, how did the plants actually interpret this? What did they do with this information? So the fact that they were like this pale green and skinny plants, yeah, I know that this is etiolation at work, right? So basically, they weren't really happy about not getting much light. And so they're sort of, you can say, their natural reaction to the absence of light is to say, okay, bye, I'm growing elsewhere, right? And at the edge, you could actually see these crest plants turning towards the light. And the other way of looking at this is to sort of understand that here I'm juxtaposing like my individual self that is to be understood in the terms that I am to other people, right? Like this particular Špela Petrič with an identity and a drive and sort of, okay, artist doing this performance. But in this sense, I'm not really bringing into consideration that we have to have been communicating with plants as we do with all the creatures that we are coexisting with. You can call it negotiation, right? And with agriculture, we're domesticating them, and sort of they are one of the staple foods, like go vegan, right? I mean, plants are there. So in a way, you can read, and this is something that I refer to then in other works, Michael Pollan's like wonderful inversions of perspective, right? How the apples and wheat and weed has enticed us to cultivate and care for these plants and spread them all over the globe, right? And even further, you can go and check out these books written on plants and the human brain, right? So you can go to experiences with ayahuasca or all intoxicating substances like nicotine or caffeine, right? So there's ways that we have always been open to these chemical signals to plants. So whether in scotopoiesis this is sort of what is actually happening or not, it's definitely evoking this, it's calling on to this ignored capacity, right? So before I came up with this work, I went to an ecologist, microbial ecologist, and I said, well, what are some examples of plant animal where plants kind of control animals, and she gave me like a bunch of them from rabbits that devise clover that devises contraceptive for rabbits when there's too many, and so it curbs the population of rabbits, to I don't know, all these ant plants, right, that invite the ants, so they feed the nectar to the ants, and then the ants predate the sapsuckers. But then I asked, is there something like this happening with humans? And she, of course, said, not that I know of. And I think it's like a particular type of blindness that we have constructed, right? This sort of border that kind of cultivates us as separate from plants. And yet, like the whole ethnobotany, all the medicine we use basically has some origins in plants, right? So it's utter ignorance to think that we are not totally susceptible to plants communicating with us. And yes, the cycle, I mean, the channels go both ways. The molecular signaling, and actually not just the principles, but sometimes even the molecules predate the separation between plants and animals and bacteria. So there's sort of like these potent molecular packages that are there, and we can sense them. And then it's a matter of the semiotic freedom that organisms have to make sense of it. And that's why, if we want to take it a step further and outside of the realm of plants, plastic, for example, communicates highly with our bodies. You know, we at this moment see it as endocrine disruption, but perhaps in the future, our bodies will have adapted to sensing the particular patterns that plastics like bisphenol A and B give us, right? So we will be able to, I don't know, taste it, and it will feel really bad. So like as a way of understanding how actually flexible these the way that we communicate through molecules is and continues to be and evolve, you know, in a slightly different time scale, but nevertheless relatively quickly, I would think, no?
Excellent, thank you. We do have one question in the chat. Actually, Grace asked the question. Do you want to just ask it verbally, Grace?
It's a little noisy here. It might be better to read off the chat. Okay.
You want me to? Okay. So Grace asked, thank you for that incredible talk. Your work is very inspiring. What has the public or viewer response to your works been in relation to what you thought it would be while making the work? Any surprises or confirmations that led the development of next artworks?
Yeah. Well, in fact, I would say for the, so I'll just refer to these last three pieces. So Lip Reader, Vegetariat Work Zero, and then Play. I think I really enjoyed that the humor element that I introduced here actually more, yeah, as a method really worked. I feel that, you know, the previous Confronting Vegetal Otherness, sometimes the topics were really, really intense. And perhaps because of this, it just took a little longer for people to I don't know, respond, or I would say I lost a lot of the audience because they weren't necessarily ready to make the commitment. And with these works, the element of humor, I think, is like a hook. It's a trap, you know, and I think that's like quite effective. That is not to undermine, I mean, it's precisely because I'm talking about really serious things that I use humor. I'm really kind of looking forward to experiencing the responses to Play a little bit more, which has been sort of slow because of COVID. So not a lot of in-person talking, a lot of presenting like this, but not really having the people just experience the work without my interpretation. But to answer like this last question, where to go next? So definitely, this is actually the points where I am and just kicking off the next step, which is actually not going towards a more sophisticated plant AI, but rather going to look at at authentic places where these plant machines already exist. And this is greenhouses on one hand, and on the other hand, medical centers where the automation of care is kind of really also present, right? And I sort of would like to do like a sort of a comparative study between the greenhouses and that automation of care, where automation is kind of okay, but care you sort of question because it's more like a product, right? I mean, it's a commodity, it's tomatoes. And on the other hand, the medical institutions where I think we very easily have an affective transfer. So we have like a lot of emotions, but ultimately they work in this way precisely because of a strict, decision tree, which is implemented either, just like by doctors or increasingly by neural networks or just different types of automation. So this is where I'm going. So I want to just sort of, for a moment, leave this privileged space of the gallery where play is really fun and without consequences, and look more closely at where, where things are at stake. Yeah, to also, realize or acknowledge that it's actually quite an uncomfortable and pertinent topic.
Thank you. I know that we have some in the YouTube channel. Kwame, do you want to maybe read out some of those questions?
Yes. So this is a question from Kavi, and she asks if plants could code, what type of algorithms in your mind would they create?
Yeah, I love that question. I have no idea. I don't know. That's why I'm trying to allow them to code so they can answer the question. I don't know. I don't even know. It's so hard because I also see coding, as a sort of, I follow Flavia Zodan, right? Statement. Singularity has already happened. The moment man, the white male has uploaded his consciousness into algorithms. But you have to acknowledge that it does come from a certain type of, math, logic, war, So I think that it carries the code and this type of analysis of the world. While it works, it also carries this history with it. I'm not sure if this is proper to plants, or if, you know, also we kind of like to understand all living organisms as a type of mechanism. And I think that is very close to algorithms and sort of this intelligence, right? And making or biomimetic algorithms, neural networks. It's very much bio-inspired, but that's also premised on a similarity between information, or that living beings function through information and codes. So that's a really convoluted answer for basically saying I have no idea.
I actually have a follow-up to Kavi's question, in which she asks, or she says, I am absolutely mesmerized by the garden behind you. Can you please tell me about the plant that looks like roots coming out of the black pot? Thank you for your thought-provoking presentation.
Yeah, that's one of my babies. I love it too. So it's a Hupersia. And Hupersias, and this one, I'm sure you're thinking about this one. Yeah, and it's actually, it's an epiphyte from Southeast Asia. I think this one is from Malaysia specifically. And it is somewhere between a moss and a fern. It's called Tassel Fern. The whole group is Tassel Ferns, basically.
Cool. So maybe we can ask Roberta one more question from her room, because I know that Roberta has to go at some point, and then we can come back to Kwame for the other questions in the YouTube channel. Oh, you're good? Okay, good. Okay, back to you, Kwame.
And this is a question from Professor Joel Ong. And he says, congratulations for such a beautiful trajectory of works. And he asks if you've considered or worried about the framing of bioart as reinforcing an anthropocentric hierarchy of importance by prioritizing human scale experience, despite your work showing us some longer time scales that frustrate our expectations.
Wow, yeah, thanks so much for this question. I think, yeah, we could, I understand as a word, yeah?
Sorry, Špela, you've frozen. Sorry, Špela, you've frozen.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, it was reporting that my internet connection is unstable. Is it better now?
You're good now. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So I think like this term bioart works best for me if it's framed in terms of strictly this biotechnology reflecting somehow the lab works, either lab work, laboratory practices, and which was historically a lot of things, from sort of over-identification to critique to sort of pushing the technological capacities. And I think it's also something that has outgrown its definition now. So our practices have outgrown it. And I think we are inviting other modalities and methodologies into something that perhaps still very much is in conversation with this scientific methodology or technoscience or technology, right? But then it's very much also situating this knowledge as one of the many, right? And I think that I would say it's a responsibility. I like to frame it as I can't not engage because to sort of say to reject it fully might miss some key elements of how to make transformation of these tools happen, because they're here and primarily because they work, right? So they have they wield a lot of power with them. And I don't think that just because they're unjust or biased, or I don't know, we would like to reject many of these mesoscalic, anthropocentric practices. They're not really going away. And I think, at least I see my task as finding sort of mistakes, but sort of precious, like lucrative, sexy ways of appropriating this or playing with it, toying with it, in order to open it up for this unexpected. And yeah, it's kind of also complicated to sort of, I don't necessarily see that I don't immediately see a way of doing it otherwise that would somehow overturn, revolutionize our relations, because we're so embedded in this Western construct, right? And so, as a person that has kind of like been living in this is like my experience of plants, really, right? So I'm just trying the best that I can do within this very particular context, and that's why I continue to engage with these apparatuses, because I'm a native to them, and I critique them as much as I can. And the others that are native to other contexts, I'm welcoming for that input as well. But yeah, this is sort of where I swim, because it's where I can be, I think, subversive the best.
Awesome, thank you. Do we have any more questions? I have a couple of more, but I want to make sure everyone gets their voices heard. Anybody else? Okay. I won't. I mean, I could probably talk to you for a while, so I might just save that for another time. But I do have a question about your cucumber plant, just having had my own first experience with the cucumber. So first of all, it's kind of a two-part question. The first question is just, what are you going to do when this cucumber takes over? And because it inevitably will. I mean, the cucumber plant that I grew was just one single guy, and he just like took over 6 feet by 6 feet of my fence and just completely dominated all the other plants and climbed all over the tomatoes and stomped out my zucchinis. And so he was very prolific little guy. And so that's like, how are you handling that? Are you pruning it down? Does it matter? Are you interested in this sort of thing overtaking this algorithmic sort of machine that you've created? And then also, once you're done with your project, how do you handle the cucumber plant? How do you think about that whole process, that interrelationship? Is there a beginning? Is there an end? How are you going to handle that?
Yeah. So, nice question. It cuts kind of to the heart of this safe laboratory. I mean, safe gallery space is a laboratory, right? Like the cucumbers, even though they are growing under 2 awesome grow lights and, get the best soil, it's not like outside, right? So they never achieve the same type of vigor and growth as they would if they were actually growing in the sun. They are attacked by pests a lot, and they do grow quite tall, but also by that time they sort of start, or have up till now started drying, right? And also the cucumbers, I mean, even if they're outside, I think they sort of last like 3 or 4 months, right? And they die back, right? So they're annuals, basically. So I accept that they have a lifespan of 3 to 4 months, which they achieve and then usually die. And I mean, they die, but sometimes they are actually taken down and out, even before that happens. And I think it's kind of something that I'm not absolutely, I don't have like a good way of explaining that part of it in order to make it sound nicer than it actually is, right? This is sort of like a working relationship. and they are incorporated in the work, and they actually live their life and have cucumbers, and it's really nice. And then I harvest them. And, you know, if the work is standing for 8 months, as it will be now from December on, that's like 3 or 4 seasons, right, of these cucumbers. And the cucumbers, we eat them or we give them to the fish, which they really like. So they do have this, they're entering a sort of a cycle. The other thing is, when does it start? When the seeds are in the ground. And what is the issue of when they take over? Yes, that's exactly why the robot itself is kind of precarious. So basically, when the motors are so weak that actually the cucumber can even hold them. So there's, I mean, it's really, and also they're just strings, right? They're metal strings. So what happens is that the cucumbers pull on them, right? So it sort of gets tangled, and I don't think that it is because the robot is on this, you know, like pushing the limits of its capacity. So the motors are really weak, like everything is kind of fragile over there. I wouldn't say that it is. There's a high probability that the cucumbers overpower it, right? And then they get in the way, and somehow the camera isn't actually able to get a clear view anymore because the cucumbers are obscuring it, so forth. That is actually really enjoyable, and yeah, I love it when that happens, when just, you know, there's this unexpected life, and the cucumbers don't only hang on to the threads, I mean the wires, but also on the sides, you know, like all of this is kind of desired.
Yeah, no, but I mean, in a way, like you're writing the algorithm, you have this machine sort of mediating this sort of experience that you helped create, and then also you're maintaining it and caring for it and helping. Like I see like the human aspect is very, very present in there. So it's, I don't know, I mean, are you not a referee, but you're sort of watching the game and making sure that everyone stays in the boundaries, I guess, in a certain extent. Do you see yourself playing a role in this, or do you really just hands off and let it be what it is?
Yeah, oh man. Now you really touched upon like another really important aspect of all bio artwork or hybrid artwork, right? It's always a performance. I mean, here clearly you have the machine and the cucumbers that are doing their own life thing, but also the maintenance is like super huge, and not so much about keeping the cucumber in bounds, but rather, you know, fixing what goes wrong with the robot and fixing problems, bugs in the code, like components burning out, motors that stop working, replacing them, and yeah, okay, tending to the cucumbers by watering them or spraying them if they get infected with something. So there is actually a lot of support maintenance that is not necessarily refereeing the game, actually, because, you know, that is the only thing that we're really not intervening with. It's like all the whole like condition for something like that to happen, that we're really working hard towards.
Yeah, but I mean, engaging with anything, like my garden, it's a full time, like it's like you're loving it.
Yeah.
You know, and you're loving the machine, you're loving the plant, you're taking responsibility. There's an ethical relationship there that transforms you as well as the machine and the plant, and I find that very interesting. So.
Yeah. No, it's this kind of baby, and I think that's why it's also so pleasurable, you know, to watch it develop and grow, and it's really surprising. And I don't know, if I had the possibility, I would probably be living with it, you know, just like here's the space for play.
Yeah, no, I can see this lasting quite long. And that leads me to the last question is, how long does this exhibit for normally in your mind? You know, would this be up for a month, or as you just said, 8 months, or can you see it being up for longer?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, it's going to go through a lot of spare parts, and this maintenance. But to be honest, the Benjamin Fele, who's working on the AI, the neural network part, is only now starting to really have the material to be able to take it and onto another really interesting level for him, right? Because it's just only with this big data, enough data points, can you really start programming something that is like more sophisticated. So I hope that actually this work grows old, in terms of it has all these generations, and then we see it also change through time.
Fabulous, thank you. Just one last comment. Grace also just wrote, I love the idea that you're entangling the idea of gardening, tending to the machine and the plants. So
yeah, it's a great one.
Okay, does anybody else have any more questions for Špela? No, we're good. Okay.
I did have one. I do have one. I was very interested in what you were talking about, building a relationship with the plant, and I'm interested in these openings that may appear when you're building trust between like yourself or the group that surrounding the plant or working with the plant. So I'd be interested to know how this trust is built when you feel like the plant is responding. I guess an example would be of an opening that I'm thinking is that it starts to respond better to your intentions, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely, I think, a lot of a major components of these works, and especially of this last one play, was like to have the time that we spent together, and I'm talking about the whole posse, so including plants and people, right? That it's sort of a joyful experience. I think that was through like the whole COVID, how are we going to make this work? What are we doing anyway? The guiding principle was not like what to achieve, but how can we have a good time while getting there? And I think that also gave like a sense of an accomplishment of something that was like greater than each one could possibly imagine in terms of the people, but also I think in terms of plants. And I don't know if this is just because of no, I know why this is. This is because some of the people in the group are actually growers, and so as I have been traveling a lot, I have been also asking them to take care of the plants. So around this posse, around this play, there's not only me, but that grows plants, but there's an increasingly larger number of people who have become cucumber specialists, right? And so I think this is definitely, you're like sort of hitting the nail on the head with this question.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, if it's growing, I'd like to, I imagine that growers, as you say, they are expanding. It could be, a global network of of that. Yeah, that would be very interesting. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. So Michael, do you have anything you want to follow up with, or?
Yes, I just wanted to thank everyone for being here this afternoon. It was wonderful to hear, Špela, your talk. I enjoyed it immensely, and it was great to hear all of the questions and the discussion that resulted from the conversation. And certainly, I think all of us would look forward to an opportunity to see the work face to face and be able to engage with the plants and the machines. So I hope that one day one of us will have that opportunity, and it would be fantastic. So thank you. And then just in closing, I just want to remind everybody that, as we said, this was the inaugural talk of the AI Talk series, and we have two more coming before the winter break. One is with Yuan-Su Kang, who will be speaking here on Monday again at 2 p.m. So please join us for that. And then Jake Elwes is going to come and talk about some of his projects, and that'll be December 8th at 4 p.m. So please make a note in your calendar, and we look forward to seeing you there. So thank you for joining us, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Okay, so we're just gonna wait until some people filter off, and then we should probably stop streaming to YouTube as well.